Okay, hello everyone. And then, this is probably not the first time on this stage, but the first time that I'm actually talking about my work. Again, hello, I'm Solip Park. I'm also a co-host of Games Now, but in this time, I'm going to be a speaker of Games Now, finally. So aside from this co-hosting of Games Now, I'm also a game researcher as well, and recently defended my doctoral of arts degree here at Aalto University. And this is going to be mainly about my game research topic and what I've been researching for the past 4 years, which is title, Understanding Game Work Migration, Game Expats in Finland. So it's going to be a talk about migrants in the video game industry, more specifically here in Finland, but I will also cover some stories that I'm also doing right now, which is a study about outside of Finland as well. So it's great to be able to share my research topic with Games Now finally. And because I'm on the stage, you know the live illustration is me doing, and I don't have 2 bodies, I don't have 4 hands, so unfortunately the live illustration will be somewhat paused for now. So game work migration is a term that I had to come up with because it's very common in IT, video game sectors, but we actually don't pretty much talk about it, maybe because it's so common, or maybe it's not, like it's so new that it didn't came up in our radar just yet. So what happened is that game industry is very international, global phenomenon. It's one of the widely explored and played medium in 21st century. And obviously, lots of internationals are working in video game industry all around the world. That means there's also a lot of migration happening, people moving to different countries in order to work for the video game industry, or vice versa. I mean, they could be in a stance that there is no video game studios to work in the home country, so people have to migrate in order to work and pursue their game career. There's also people who might just stay remotely in a home country working for game projects or companies outside the border. So that's also all covered in game work migration. As you can see, there's many different forms of migration. So one of my research is to a little bit more clarify what are the things that are happening out there in the world. And then my focus is that, so when people migrate, people tend to also behave differently. They also make changes in the society. So how does game making changes once people migrate and once new cultures, per se, encounter each other? Just also let you know, the image that you will see on the screen, you probably can recognize it. Yes, that's all me drawing. Actually, I draw a comic series called Game Expats Story on Instagram and social media and post it there together with my research. So if you're interested, you can already find me on Instagram and check Game Expats Story, solip.comic on Instagram, and you can see all the images there that was part of my research. So when people move and when people make games, it involves 2 various different practices. One is very high technical practices, and one is very we call it soft skill as well, very cultural, subjective manners of things. So technical thing is that what type of game engine, what type of software do you use? Obviously, it involves very much digital game. So digital games development involves you have to know how to use a computer. You have to know certain programming language. You need to know some system architecture, etc., etc., 2D, 3D graphics, lighting. Those are involved in very technical aspects, the technical skill set that you will often get trained either in school or online, etc., to hone your technical skill set in order to make games. However, most of the game that you play in these days are made out of more than 2 people. So you have to communicate with someone else, just like in this game jam that we're hosting today. you're gonna involve with peoples from all around the world, perhaps different backgrounds here and there, and you have to communicate, you ideate, and that involves lots of cultural, subjective, soft skill aspects of it. So when we talk about game development, it's actually not always identical. It's not always the same all around the world, but I'll get back to that a little bit later. I'm going to use the word game expats throughout this presentation, which is also part of the title of my thesis. It's just kind of like a temporary term that I started 4 years ago, but then kind of ended up in this situation. If anybody can come up with the new, better, inclusive terms, I'm always happy to talk about it. So right now, the definition stands like this. Game expats means individuals who experience either assigned or self-initiated migration, meaning that they migrated based on their own needs or based on how the company wants them to be, primarily due to their game profession, so they're game developers, but with or without concrete long-term future plans for settlement, because directly or indirectly due to precarious job contracts of the video game industry. So video game work could be permanent job or fixed term, part-time. There's a lot of different contracts out there. And then in order to live in another country, you need visa, you need residence permit, and all these other variables involved. That means that a lot of the game expats who I spoke with, some of them were a bit reluctant to be called immigrants because it sounds like you're permanently migrated to one country or another. Whereas then the reality is that you just don't know. Your work contract might expire. You might decide to move on to another country for better salary or different career. Who knows? So that's why the intermediate, mediated term, temporary term, turned into expatriates. So international workers, and then shortened as expats. But of course, this is the term that I sort of use based on what my research participants told me. But of course, the terms can be changed, and I'm always open for discussion. So when one person migrates to another country, to the society, you can't just immediately put in and then changes and integrate all at once. According to the acculturation theory, there are 4 different types of integration. So one is obviously integration. So when the migrant perceives value to maintain their own values, their cultural background, their practices, in this case, how they make game, the practices of making game, they will keep it, but at the same time, they will also embrace what is dominant in the new country. So quite like a mutual accommodation, we call it that way. Assimilation is when the migrants have to abandon a lot of the things they brought from their home country, their practices, their know-hows, their cultural background, in order to blend into the new environment. This is often called melting pot strategy, that no matter where you come, you're going to melt into this pot. There's other thing is segregation, when their peoples are more isolated in the new environment with either due to discrimination. Similarly, marginalization, which is kind of the worst, where they're isolated and they're not actually integrating or interacting with the new host environment, making them in a very isolated social bubble, never to be able to be integrated fully. So you can see many different types of acculturation out there. So based on this and the discussion that I mentioned before, how dominant the game work migration is in all around the world, I made 6 different publications, which is part of my doctoral of arts thesis. So it's a little bit small text out there, but then you can Google it. They're all open access. Please read it. And actually, one of them includes our case study from Games Now Cross-Cultural Jam of how this type of cross-cultural in the game education scene helps game developers to learn about the new different cultures. So I'll get back to that a little bit on detail and later in the slide. And oh, by the way, I forgot to mention this number. Game work migration is very common here in Finland. The statistics shows from Neogames, recent data shows that roughly 30% of people working in the Finnish game industries have migrant background. So including myself, I'm from Korea, now living in Finland. And higher numbers are also reported in other part of the European countries. So you'll notice how common it is. So what I found by talking with a lot of game expats here in Finland is that they also they can't come up with the long-term future. The industry is so fast changing, and then sometimes game companies are like really eager for talent import, bringing a lot of people in, but at the same time the recession might comes in. So it's more about like what's happening now. What I'm doing right now is a lot of my research participants' interests war. So yeah, game industry is very vibrant. What was also interesting is that they tend to have a different associations between technical skill sets and cultural soft skill set that they need on the game development. So for example, a lot of the game expats will say, game development, it's all the same all around the world. We use Unity, we use Unreal, we use like this graphic tools, that graphic tools, Blender, etc. It's all the same. They will start mostly like that in the conversation, but then later in the interview, and then when they're relaxed and then start to talk more casually, they will talk about how much it is different, mostly related to soft skills, how people tend to communicate, what is more prioritized in game design compared to some other countries or other parts of the company. So depending on company to company, country to country, or even team between the team within the same company, tend to have different ways of communicating, how to validate the task, and it's more importantly, what is most valued in your game design. So what type of design values that you're really want to persuade your audience when you make your game. So that's very much difference here and there. And then when the company is especially under the influence of global game industry, perhaps you're using third-party game engine like Unity, or your company is actually directly affiliated to the global publisher like AAA company in the US, and they own a large part of your shares of your game studio here in Finland, et cetera, then you're obviously influenced both global influence as well as the local context as well. So you have to, like the leadership style or KPI, key performance indicators might be coming from abroad, but then you still have to mitigate with the local because you still have to communicate with the local people in order to make games. So this is always like a mediating things. And then the good thing about this local contact is that this is the one that makes people to think about whether I should settle down here in Finland. I prefer this local element, perhaps horizontal work environment here in Finland, or short working hours, etc., and social benefits. Maybe I will like to more communicate with the Finns here and making games, and that's kind of what makes the long-term settlement intention possible here among the game expats. Whereas in global factors generally means that, you know, it's the same. They use Unity everywhere, so I can just migrate to another country. Easy. So it will continue. So while the global influence sort of push people outwards, while local contacts, if positive factors emerge, then it will likely to cause more a settlement intention, people intending to stay longer. But at the same time, there's a drawback. At least here in Finland, a lot of the game companies use the term culture. So it could be cultural fit, cultural add, or vice, et cetera, talking about how important the soft skill is, and it's a little bit vague, especially for migrants' perspective, according to what my research participant says. They're like, is it a culture about what? So it's sort of vague, and it's often very not described very concretely by the game companies. It could be what sort of games you like. It could be what sort of leisure experience what you do outside of the work, what type of game designs that you like the most, or just an attitude. Like, do you wear suit? Do you wear game t-shirt? Do you prefer Zelda? Do you prefer Mario? Like, there is a whole bunch of unknown factors out there that could be very vague for newcomers to understand. And this cultural fitness affects a lot of hirings here in the Finnish game industry, which also makes a little bit more pressure for the game expats who need to have a job, especially for non-EU citizens who need a residence permit in order to stay here. So they always kind of like, what is the culture, what they're meaning to? And of course, if you stay here long enough, you will get it. And then if you interacted with the Finnish game developers long enough in that company, you will eventually get it, but it's not always guaranteed, and it takes a long time to get there. Good side about this cultural thing here in Finland is that the game development ecosystem is quite active and very open. So there's like this bonding of this community, game developers community, that shares the job postings, shares about the know-hows, which is very great at the same time. But so you can see that it is offering belongingness and feeling of community towards the peoples already in the network, but perhaps it's a little bit still difficult to enter in the first glance for the game expats when they first arrive. And not to mention that, game industry is not always open, especially when it comes to the global type of a pipeline. There is a geographical hierarchies. There's also class stratification, meaning that some developers are a little bit more privileged than the others. Not to mention there's a lot of freelancers and outsourced game developers who will never be credited on their games in the end. There's a lot of this like QA, or there's also like freelance, especially like asset making geek economy out there, that you will like make something for the game, but then you're like a lower in this hierarchy system that you will never be noticed. And are we consider them as part of the community, or are they just like paid for the work? So that's always like dilemma here in the game industry about how much we can be inclusive and equal to game developers out there. And then some game companies are really, really reluctant to share any of their knowledges to outside of their corporate zone. Not so much here in Finland, but then especially in the large corporations like AAA size companies, that a lot of the developers are bound to NDA, non-disclose agreement, that they cannot say anything what happened in the company, which also kind of struggles for the developers to form a community, but at the same time, a little bit difficult for us, the researchers, in order to talk with these developers and try to figure out how to improve it. So overall, what I found is that this term cultural fit that is quite common here in the Finnish game industry is actually not about finding the person who's fit, but more like try to find out who's not cultural fit. A lot of the difference, like labor law, difficult to fire people, or also very introverted norms here in Finnish game industry, like people are a little bit more secured, meaning that people, when they hire someone, they really want to hire somebody who's already quite fit, so that it wouldn't involve a lot of conflicts, and especially for immediate productivity. When you hire someone here in Finland, they really want to make like immediately productivity-wise that you will able to work from the day one, preferably. Well, there is a probational period for usually 4 to 6 months that they will check, and then you will also check can you work together. But then it involves like shorter the better type of mentality, meaning that they really want to push, like learn how to work in this country, learn how to work in this team, and let's go immediate productivity. Because game industry is quite precarious, you need to make a profit as soon as possible. So overall, my conclusion that here in Finland, quite the game development ecosystem community is quite open, and then especially the local context, a lot of this like horizontal work culture indeed positively affects game expats in Finland to think about the settlement in this country, so that the long-term stay would be possible. However, there is a scene of assimilation happening. The game developers, when they arrive in Finland, they sort of forced to be quickly blend in by abandoning the know-hows that they brought from abroad. So that was one thing. So how can we improve it? Well, right now, Anna-Kaisa and I are trying the pedagogical effort, meaning that, let the game developers, the future game developers, know that there are different game development cultures out there, so you don't have to force people to fix their behaviors or to blend in, but then know already, don't get shocked, and try to learn how to mitigate with the differences. So that's one pedagogical effort that we do. Public supports could be involved, make the game industry a little bit less precarious, less risky, especially supporting small to medium-sized companies so that they don't have to rush for immediate productivity to survive. Industry effort, probably game studio, especially the established one, they could invest a little more internship and junior positions so that the people who need experience in the game industry can also experience more and gets in and then become culturally fit rather than already culturally fit and then packaged deliver, because chances are there's not many already culturally fit people out there in the world. Eventually, the big companies have to invest in their future talent. So yeah, I'm continuing this research topic. Together with Games Now, this cross-cultural game jam is actually a very important pedagogical effort that I'm doing along with my research. So I'm studying about recently, not just about Finland, but also game expats in my home country, Korea. So how game expats in South Korea are doing and what could be very different or similar here in Finland. And also working on the recent immigration reform proposal here in Finland that is also drawing a lot of attentions. I'm also working on that, seeing how that would affect the game developers community here in Finland. So that was what I've been doing for the past 4 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right, also no clapping, but thank you so much for this talk, Solip. I've been obviously seeing this, you working on the thesis so long, but it's very important work for us to understand, especially here in Finland when the percentages are so high of the immigrants or expats. So what is you're now working with trying to understand other countries, but what is Finnish features that you would pick from your study? What are those experiences of the expats that they get most shocked at? How is this different from their source country?
Yeah, so I guess in one aspect, there's several different aspects that GameExec mentions that about interesting compared to other countries. One is very senior driven. So most of the people working in the company, you will see at least 3 to 5 years of experience people in the game company, and also very small. So the head count, we call it head count, how many people are working in the company, are generally quite small. Many game studios are around 20 people. 50 considered to be really large company, 100, 200, that's Supercell level. Right now, Supercell, I think they exceeded 600.
Yeah, 600.
So that's a massive scale for the Finnish context. But if you're coming from, let's say, US, Japan, Germany, Ireland, you will often see the game companies with larger teams and then more divided work. Meaning that, you will end up in a part of the team, you will interact with the team, but you don't get the overall scope, the entire company. And then often the information, for example, daily active users, how much incentives, monies, profit that the company will get will often be limited to the high ups. Whereas in Finland, because it's relatively small, you will get those information, so information transparency due to small size of the company because you know everybody in the company. So that's one of the largest, biggest aspects that GameExpat also mentioned. And then a lot of side effects coming from there because you know everybody in the company. You tend to more talk, you can become friendly, you can directly talk to CEO if you want to, et cetera, et cetera. And also because of that, people are very, very concerned or secured about hiring a new person because one person in new hiring in like 10 people studio, that's going to affect a lot in the culture of the company. So that's also what is like side effects, snowballs from there.
So if a lot of seniors and a little bit of reluctancy to hire, how do the people get hired into the Finnish companies? How does that work in comparison perhaps for other countries?
According to what my research participant told me, is generally called referral. So mouth to mouth. Instead of job opening, there are some recruitments and job openings available, but majority of them will be like, hey, Anna-Kaisa, do you want to work with us? We got a funding recently. We're working on this like cozy game, etc. So this is how the hiring generally works. So friends or friends of the friend zone. Many of my research participants told me that they met somebody who's currently they're working with. They met these people somewhere else, like maybe outside of Finland or remote job, etc. And then they're the one who like hooked these people up to come to Finland. So referral is also very important. So meaning that you don't want to burn your bridge. You want to keep a good relationship with this person in order to keep your game career.
So would that also be a kind of a sort of like one of the factors why we have such a kind of vague description of the company culture? Because we don't have to. We already sort of like with the referral, it's like you checked it like a little bit like intuitively, already checked those people and how they would fit to your team.
Exactly.
Is that part of it?
Exactly. So it could be so normal to me, normal for this team, that you don't have to explain it. You kind of already have this culture. What is challenging here is that, well, people who already know this culture, fine. But there's also a lot of like juniors, for example, recent graduates, or people who just happen to be recruited on the opening or recruitments, somebody from a far cultural proximity, maybe from very, very far across the earth, rather than like a small network. Then those people will be very puzzled. Like, what do you mean by culture? So it works pretty well in the established community. It's a little bit slow when you try to expand. And perhaps that explains whenever the Finnish game companies try to expand their men counts, head counts, they always struggles with that hiring is so slow. And sometimes it ends up in unexpected crunch because you want to hire somebody, but the person is not coming the recruitment, some of my research participants said it took like a year or two to find the right person, meaning that you're still struggling with long work hours because there's not enough people. So it's a little bit of vicious cycle that it works in certain aspect, but it's definitely not very good when you're trying to hire more or expand your business.
How about then diversity? I mean, the cultural fit is obviously seeding into the homogeneity of the companies, but is there any hope for the Finnish companies to have a bit of like gender balance or different kind of cultural backgrounds, ethnicity, and those kind of things? How does it impact?
Oh yeah, I found it. I see quite like there are positive efforts for sure, and there are positive movements. Recently, Finnish game companies started to like not use the word cultural fit. It was very dominant a few years back when I started my research. And now recently people are like, maybe not, we will look into it, because they realize that it has some limits, as well as also the effort for gender equality, diversity and equality, not just gender, but neurodiversities, as well as a lot of people who are maybe not within the community yet. For example, because a lot of this community, especially also here in Finland, driven around a lot of beer drinking, a lot of partying, sauna involved, perhaps, that generally kind of prefers certain personalities, certain type of personalities.
Or cultural backgrounds as well.
Cultural background is like biases also put into hand. Of course, it doesn't mean that they're like sexist or racist, but unintentionally. Like your community, you're trying to hire somebody that you know of, meaning that there's not many wide range. So that, and then a few years from now, probably also maybe my research have affected. Some Finnish games companies started to look into more of an open position hiring, bringing a little bit more HR experts and getting more consultants over this. And then efforts like we in Games Finland efforts, like code of conduct, asserting the importance of diversity, equality, and inclusive in game industry, definitely making some slow but very visible changes in the past few years. So I'm very hopeful that Finnish game industry can able to move on and then become more inclusive.
Yeah, I have a final question which relates to us, of course, that what are the efforts that we as game educators can do in order to sort of like so we made a claim that we are now training for the Nordic game development culture. We don't specifically know all the details. It's very hard to sort of like reflect what it is actually. We can say what it is not, but it's hard to oftentimes like really reflect on what kind of culture we're even teaching. But what is your recommendations for other game educators to acknowledge these issues?
Yeah, there are some few recommendations I would suggest. So one is that, a lot of game education institutions out there, we're focusing on certain software tools like teaching Unity, teaching Adobe skill sets, and then sort of giving the vibe, and not all teachers, but some teachers giving this impression that when you know this technical skill set, you can work anywhere. That's not technically true. So my notion is that there is no global game industry culture that works everywhere in the world. Eventually, the game developer has to adopt and then learn how to mediate with the differences, meeting people with the different interpretations of what is game even. But it's not wrong. So just acknowledging the difference rather than saying that that's not culturally correct, etc. So try not to be homogenous and try not to blur the line, but have this attitude and teachers to teach those multicultural and cross-cultural skills for their students. That's very important. And I think that's also quite important for us. I mean, Anna-Kaisa, we've been discussing about how do we tell our future students about Nordic game development culture. And I think the word Nordic put in there is important. So acknowledge that what is normal in making games here in this region is called like Nordic, but then it could be different from other way around. I've found that at least in Korea, we don't have technically this type of terms used. We just kind of focus on, if you know this tool, you can work anywhere. Yeah. So try not to be so generalized of this global game industry culture and community. Try to acknowledge, at least start talking about it, that is very regional, is very local, and then be transparent with the students about that.
Yes, thank you, Solip, so much. We're going to go for the next talk.